During the holidays, you probably saw that people driving electric cars faced huge delays trying to recharge them. And that's before the Albanese government makes us buy electric cars by banning many petrol ones. That's its plan to do all this before 2030. And then there's the government's policies against fossil fuels that have made gas and electricity prices soar. Now, you hear the Albanese government say, oh, look, no, that's the Ukraine war. But that's not true. You just look at international gas prices today. They are now lower than a year ago, before that war. So that's no longer an excuse. But you look at what the Albanese government is now making worse with its policies. Last month, in a panic about these soaring gas prices, said, well, that's it. We're going to cap the wholesale price for Australia. Gas producers can't sell anymore, not for a year at least, their gas in Australia for more than $12 a gigajoule. But that seems to just have made things worse. Two of our biggest gas producers will not sell at that price, don't dare for legal reasons. And now our second largest energy retailer, AGL, they can't get extra gas supplies for this year, not yet. And it's saying, well, look to new customers, sorry, we can't serve you. So prices for them are really soaring. You'll be hearing a lot of people complaining about their bills. The government is threatened to send in the commercial cops, but the opposition is saying, well, we told you this wouldn't work.
We appreciate the challenges that some companies have faced to negotiate new gas agreements over the Christmas holidays. We expect the gas producers to act promptly to implement the price cap, the temporary price cap, and the ACCC is closely monitoring the behaviour of the gas producers to make sure that they're consistent with their obligations under that temporary price cap.
We warned that this would be the consequences. Economists warned that this would be the consequences. And here we are, starting the new year, and energy is going to be the number one issue for the government. And their first attempt to try and fix it has been a failure.
I told you it'd be a mess. What we need is not a cap on gas prices. What we need is an end to the war on fossil fuels, so companies dare go out and find more gas and more oil and more coal. Joining me is Matthew Warren, a former Chief Executive of the Australian Energy Council, the Energy Supply Association as well, and the Clean Energy Council. Matthew Warren, thank you so much for your time. First, can you explain why AGL cannot now buy enough gas and what that means for the rest of us?
Well, the stories out today are that the upstream gas suppliers are struggling to meet demand in Australia, and AGL is one of a number of businesses who sell gas to commercial and residential customers, and they're apparently struggling to buy gas from the gas industry. So this is all a function, a fallout of the price cap set on gas a couple of weeks ago. So the question is, how does this roll out in the domestic market? How do we find gas for those domestic customers? So it's the beginning of that sort of commercial narrative as the consequence of those price caps.
It seems to me that we do need to get back to the basic thing of encouraging gas exploration, not punishing it, because gas supplies seem absolutely crucial, getting more gas. But gosh, why would you think of something so obvious? But Matthew, I originally asked you to come on to talk about another program involving the shift away from fossil fuels, another one that's in trouble. Two of our richest billionaires, Twiggy Forrest and Mike Cannon-Brookes, had pushed a $25 billion scheme to build the biggest solar farm, this one in the Northern Territory, and then ship the electricity along the world's longest cable to Singapore. But the project has collapsed. The receivers have been called in. Now, first, before I get into the bizarre response of the Federal Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, can you tell us why this project has gone belly up?
I guess, I mean, speaking from a member of the energy industry that's been looking at this project for a while, it always had hairs on it. It always seemed a fairly risky, fairly adventurous kind of project, and that's because it was attempting to do everything bigger and at a scale that had never been done before, and by a startup business that really had no pedigree in either deploying large-scale solar, in accessing the biggest battery bank in the world, and building the longest undersea electricity cable in the world. So on those sort of criteria, it was never demonstrated that the startup had the expertise to execute that. And more importantly, there was never any sign that Singaporeans were particularly interested in buying their electricity from this project.
You also point out a very interesting thing in a piece you wrote over the holidays, that here we have a solar farm that is to the east of Singapore, which means that at peak demand time in Singapore, which you would presume be around when people tend to be clocking off from work, we're approaching darkness. So really, geographically, this scheme didn't work, did it?
No. I mean, the way to compensate for that is to buy a very large quantity of batteries, so that you're filling these batteries and then discharging those. But that's an incredibly expensive way of supplying electricity before you even put it on a 4,200 kilometre undersea cable. So that didn't make sense either. It makes a lot more sense if you're going to build large-scale solar in Central Australia to run it into Brisbane and to Sydney, because they're due east of that solar, which means the sun is still shining in Central Australia when it's set in Brisbane and Sydney, and the evening peaks are really the critical game every day. So there is real value potentially in doing that if you can get the numbers to work. It's certainly a lot more commercially sensible than running a cable, 4,200 kilometres north of Darwin, in addition to 800 kilometres of overland transmission as well from the solar farm to Darwin itself.
Now, Matthew, there was something about this whole thing that really disturbed me. It's that Energy Minister Chris Bowen last week was still claiming that this project, solar power in Australia, sell it to Singapore, well, the latest troubles, calling the receivers just a flesh wound, and this project would still go on. Here he is.
I remain very upbeat and excited about Sun Cable's future.
He said that last week, Matthew, but today one of Twiggy Forrest's top executives is reported saying, well, no, the project was not viable. The cable to Singapore was just too expensive, and I'm guessing Forrest is now looking at what you just earlier suggested, maybe the solar farm could sell electricity to Australia. But would that work?
It's still pretty challenging. It's a very large project. Probably the biggest difficulty will be the transmission connection. I mean, there is a very long queue of projects trying to get connected via transmission at the moment. So they would be looking at 1,000 kilometres or more of transmission to run the solar farm into those markets. And it's, I'd be guessing, but I wouldn't imagine that could get started till the 2030s. So, there are some very serious and real constraints in investment in energy infrastructure in Australia, and if you want billionaires to help, that's the kind of things that they should be working on rather than perhaps large-scale projects to Singapore. So, long-term storage and transmission infrastructure are probably the two key bits of infrastructure that are needed at the moment.
Yeah, well, what disturbs me about Chris Bowen, we remember, of course, that when the head of Snowy Hydro, then head, said to him, well, you can't run the next gas project at Kurri Kurri, funded by a government, on hydrogen, green hydrogen. You can't do it. The guy lost his job. And now Chris Bowen is backing another technology that the actual people running it says, well, that won't work either. He seems to me a little bit too ideologically obsessed. This is a very concerning problem with him. Matthew Warren, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.